put.
Anybody would turn that down? I don't know why. Did we chart already?
Yes.
You guys are fast.
Check.
The 10th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by Blooms in Omaha, featuring floral arrangements and gifts. And by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Saturday at 6 p.m.
Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news. Once again, from the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, here is your host, Andrea McMaster.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Consider This. There is no pandemic flu in the world today, but there have been 3 pandemics in the last 90 years. And flu experts say that another deadly pandemic is a real possibility. Bird flu is the most likely candidate, and experts fear this virus could change and set off the next human pandemic. Our guest today is Sharon Metcalf, who is the Associate Director of the Center for Biopreparedness Education. She travels the state educating people on how to be prepared during disasters. Her talks now mostly focus on the bird flu, and glad to have you with us today, Sharon.
Thank you, Andrea. Glad to be here.
And so tell us a little bit first, a background about the Center for Biopreparedness Education, where you're employed. And I know it's a joint funded by the CDC and the Health Resources and Services Administration, right? And a joint endeavor from the University of Nebraska Medical Center and Creighton University.
Creighton, yeah, which is kind of a unique situation, which is nice. It was established in the fall of 2002 when the Homeland Security dollars started flowing to every state for preparedness. Part of those dollars had to be allocated to training and education, and in every other state other than Nebraska, that money was left at the state health department. At the time, Dr. Raymond was our chief medical officer, and what he wanted was the training dollars to go to a training institution or an academic institution. And better yet, why not 2? So he actually came up with the concept of this being a joint project between University and Creighton, UNMC and Creighton. So we're actually housed at UNMC, but again, we're a joint project and we serve the whole state. So we started out with training geared more towards sort of terrorism issues like biological, chemical, or nuclear, but have obviously involved into an all hazards disaster preparedness, and then of course Mother Nature is the terrorist in the case of influenza, particularly H5N1.
Okay, and so talking about avian flu, bird flu, pandemic flu, that's really been a focus of yours recently, traveling the state, speaking at businesses, churches, organizations. Why is this so critical to get the word out, to explain what this is and how we should be prepared?
Well, one of the main reasons is historical. If we look back to some of the pandemics we've had in the last 100 years and learn from the lessons learned therein, we know that some of the things that we need to do to prepare for a pandemic are things we need to do ahead of time. So the sooner we can get the information out to the general public and to our responders and to businesses and communities about just about what it is, first of all. What is a pandemic? What is the flu? How does it spread? And things like that. So that when we begin to talk down the road about what public health is going to do, that people understand why public health is doing what they're doing. And then people have time, hopefully the luxury of time, to be able to prepare in their homes for something like that to happen.
Okay. We hear so many questions about, is this a real possibility? There is so much maybe hype in some people's eyes about bird flu, thinking it's really never going to happen. It's not going to happen to me. It's not going to happen in my neighborhood, not in my community. I'm never going to know anybody who has bird flu. And so anyway, I know that that's really a big focus of your education, is saying, you know what? It's a possibility it will happen, and we do need to be prepared. So let's go back into some of the history. I know that you've talked about what about past flu pandemics.
Okay.
And so it started with the Spanish flu in 1918.
Right. We've had 3 pandemics in the last 100 years or so, and the first one was in 19, by far the worst, about 20 to 40 million deaths worldwide, about 675,000 here in the United States alone, probably relatively conservative numbers based on the record keeping that occurred then. When I say that we need to learn from our lessons, we need to learn the lessons from past pandemics, that one is the best example. There's a very nice book out by a fellow named John Barry called The Great Influenza, and what it does is it talks about what public health learned from the pandemic in 1918. And it says things like, if I had known what was going to happen after I held a parade, we would have canceled the parade. And Philadelphia is a perfect example of that, is they held a parade in 1918 to sell war bonds. Public health pleaded with government officials not to hold the parade because people were going to be in close proximity to one another, obviously standing in the streets. Sure enough, they had the parade. Within a couple of days, thousands of people were dying every single day in the city of Philadelphia. Now, there were other cities that fared much better because they actually implemented some of these strategies that we call social distancing, meaning canceling large gatherings, even canceling school for short periods of time. And so we need to learn from that, and we'd be remiss if we didn't. So that was by far the worst. Then in 1958, we had the Asian flu, and in 68 we had the Hong Kong flu. Far fewer deaths worldwide and in the United States, but pandemics nonetheless, because they were started by brand new viruses that we've never seen before. And that's probably one of the biggest educational issues that we have to give right now, is that a pandemic is caused by a virus that we aren't typically used to seeing, that our immunity hasn't seen before, our bodies haven't seen before, never been in our flu shots in the last 20, 30 years, so we really don't have a good or are able to build up a good response to it. As opposed to what circulates every year as flu viruses, we've seen those more or less, our bodies have seen those. H5N1, which most people know is the bird flu, is such a new virus. We've never seen this before. It just so happens to also be a highly lethal virus. So now we've got a bit of a double whammy going here. One, it's a new virus that we've never seen. 2, it's one that causes a lot of mortality.
And how do you answer that? And putting it really into perspective, will this occur? Is it a real possibility when people ask you that?
Well, I truly think and believe that the stars are lining up for another pandemic to happen, particularly with H5N1 as being that culprit. Whether I can say for sure, I know there are a lot of experts out there that are saying that it's not a matter of if but when, and I really don't like to do that because I really don't know that, but I really do think that things are lining up and suggesting very, very strongly that this will be the culprit for the next pandemic.
Okay, well, the next graphic that we're going to look at, it talks about really, you mentioned lethal, how deadly this virus can be, so putting that into perspective.
Well, the graph in front of you is actually putting into perspective the number of deaths that occurred in the 1918 pandemic in comparison to some of the other events that have happened, like the Civil War, like the Spanish War, Korean War, Vietnam War. And so I think people are always very surprised to see that the number of deaths or fatalities that occurred as a result of the 1918 pandemic is really very significant on a large perspective. So this particular graph really does hit home with a lot of people when they realize that, wow, it was maybe underestimated at the time.
Okay, and then now, what consequences might result from a pandemic now?
Well, what we've done is we've taken the data from the last 3 pandemics and fed it through computer models, because in order for our infrastructure, healthcare, like hospitals, et cetera, and response communities to be able to understand what they're dealing with, they need to see numbers. So by feeding this through a computer model, we're able to see what we're looking at in terms of numbers of affected. So we based this particular one on on about a 30% attack rate, meaning 1 in every 3 people will actually get infected. You can look at on the average of between anywhere at 20 and a 45. So we're picking a middle of the road attack rate. So what we're looking at is 1 in every 3 people infected. So in the state of Nebraska, which has 1.7 million, we're looking at about 500,000 people being infected with the pandemic virus. Now, how does that translate into hospitalizations? Well, we're looking at somewhere between 4,900 and 56,000 people requiring hospital care as a result of this pandemic. Now, this will be granted over a period of about 18 months to 24 months, which is what a pandemic normally spans. But we don't have the healthcare capacity to handle that. So hospitals now are charged with doing what we call surge capacity planning. So they have to figure out what they're going to do with these increased numbers of people that are going to need medical care. So it's going to look very different to a lot of people. There's going to be more of a tiered kind of approach. Hospitals are going to look at where they can put more beds, how they can handle more people, strategies such as canceling elective surgeries, who can be discharged, looking at where they can move people around, how they can best care for people in that kind of a number. Communities will be looking at how they can house people in places like auditoriums and armories and things like that. And then there'll be a large focus on actually caring for people in their own homes, because your family members are actually going to play a large role in caring for you if you become ill.
And will it be very important to have those individuals who are infected quarantined in the hospital setting or in a community setting?
Good question. Yes, because the problem with being infected with influenza, whether it's bird flu or it's any other influenza, is that it transmits itself by being what we call a droplet organism. So basically, it amounts to the fact that if I'm infected with influenza and you're 3 to 6 feet from me, you're fair game. So all the public health planning that you'll see surrounding pandemics or surrounding influenza are based on that premise that we need to keep people 6 feet apart. So if you're any closer than that to someone who is infected and you're not using any kind of protection, you're going to be fair game. So yes, we're going to want people who are ill to be home because they're going to be shedding that virus. We're going to want people who have been exposed to the ill to actually voluntarily quarantine themselves at home. The reason for that is because influenza is kind of precarious, and it's got unique characteristics in that I'm actually going to shed influenza virus a full 24 hours before I know I'm sick. So if I know I've been exposed to someone who's actively infected, I'm not going to know at what point I'm going to be shedding virus. So that quarantine of people who are exposed is going to play a key role as well.
Okay, well, let's talk about why it got the bird flu in the first place. Some of the basics that we have been hearing and about on the news, but let's just talk about where it started.
Okay, it actually originated in Hong Kong in 1997. And you may remember that they culled 1.5 million birds in about 3 days, and I know it hit the CNN news pretty hard at that time. And it worked for a couple of years, but it ended up coming back. Now, the human cases didn't come along for a couple of years after that. Those are really cases in birds. And so they came along a few years later and have spread to the countries that we've been following on the news in terms of what it is. Now, what I do want to point out is that birds have carried influenza A always. And all 3 of those pandemics that I showed you that have occurred in the last 100 years actually began in birds. So this phenomena of a bird carrying an influenza virus and becoming a pandemic is not something we haven't seen before.
Okay. The big thing that you're saying is, well, let's talk first how birds become infected.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, bird flu affects birds differently. And that's problematic because in a domestic flock of birds, those birds tend to be symptomatic, meaning we can tell when that flock is ill or when there are birds in that flock that are ill. And then we can do something about the flock, like completely eliminate the flock, and really, which is the strategy that they use.
And that has been happening.
It has been happening. We've heard of it in England of late. The birds that are infected are going to shed it in their saliva and in their feces. So any close contact with these birds is going to be a dangerous practice, in essence, for anyone who might contract bird flu. Now, wild birds or migratory birds actually tend to be what we say is asymptomatic, meaning they don't show symptoms. So they're carrying the virus, they're shedding the virus, but we can't look at them and tell that they're ill. So that will have implications for all those of us that are doing surveillance and looking for the illness. It's one thing when you can see it in a flock, it's another thing when you don't know if it's in migratory birds.
Okay. We have seen some cases of humans getting the bird flu. So how do humans become infected with it?
Well, as of today, the humans that have contracted the bird flu have only contracted it by virtue of being in close contact with infected birds. And that's the reason that you're seeing this particular H5N1 or bird flu in humans, mostly in the Far East, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, places like that. The reason for that is their culture is such that they live in close proximity to birds. It is not unusual to go down to the market, buy your bird live, bring it home, kill it at home, and cook it up for dinner. That's what cultures do. So that creates a situation where you're in very close contact with an infected bird and you may not know it. So again, we're only getting this bird flu today from contact with infected birds. It is not being spread person to person in a sustained manner. And that's kind of what we're waiting for right now, is that situation where that virus, that H5N1, which is the bird flu, mutates, or what we call reassorts, with another virus, a human virus, and then takes on that characteristic of being transmissible person to person. Okay. And that's what we worry about.
So that's what's so key. We haven't seen that yet, person to person. transmission with the virus, but that possibility is there.
You bet.
And why is that possibility there? What would need to happen in order for that to occur?
Well, the way I describe it is this. Pretend that I go down to pretend I live in Thailand and I go down to the market and I buy my chicken for dinner, cook it up, kill it and cook it up for dinner. Let's pretend I actually bought an infected bird and I've become ill with bird flu. So I'm sick right now with bird flu, which if you've been watching the news about it, I have about a 50-50 chance of making it. It's got a very high mortality rate. At the same time that I'm sick with this bird flu, pretend I contract a human flu from a family member, which doesn't have a very high mortality rate, as you know, it's just influenza, but it has that characteristic of being transmissible person to person. So I've got two viruses now, two influenza viruses in my body. What they're most likely going to do is begin to exchange genetic material. So what could emerge from this co-infection of these two influenza viruses could be a new virus that takes on that lethal characteristic of the bird flu, but also takes on that characteristic of the human flu, and now I can pass it human to human to human. That's the scenario that we're basically poised and waiting to happen, and that's called reassortment.
And have we seen that in the past with any type of other viruses before? I mean, that a possibility that the two can mutate together.
We've seen that with influenza viruses in the past.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Can bird flu be treated? That's a huge question. Everybody says that.
The answer is possibly. They're having some success with medications called antivirals. Now, antivirals are different than antibacterials or antibiotics, as you know of, in that antivirals work on viruses, and bird flu is a virus. There are several categories of antivirals. There are the amantadines and rimantadines, and then there's the Tamiflus and Rilenzas. H5N1, the bird flu, is actually responding well to oseltamivir, also known as Tamiflu. So all of the public health strategies that you're going to be hearing about in terms of stockpiling are going to be geared towards what we know about bird flu responding well to Tamiflu. So Tamiflu will be the antiviral that you will hear about being stockpiled.
Okay. And then the next question, will that flu vaccine, will that actually protect me?
Well, the answer to that is actually no. The flu vaccine that you get every single year, hopefully, has never contained H5N1. It's contained all kinds of other influenza viruses, but it hasn't contained H5N1. So today, as it stands, even if I've gotten a flu shot for the last 30 years, I would not be protected against H5N1. However, and this is what I always tell my audiences, that if what emerges is as that virus for the pandemic, that in that scenario that I described to you earlier, if what emerges looks anything like what we've had in our flu shots in the last 20, 30 years, we may actually be in luck. So that's what I use as ammunition to the communities that I visit in saying, continue to get your annual flu shot because you're building up immunity to all kinds of viruses that have been around in the past.
Okay, key. Surveillance. There are so many people in our community watching what's happening. There are so many people in our community who are meeting together to prepare in case something does happen. Explain a little bit about who's watching and why that is so key that people are watching who becomes ill.
Okay. The reason that it's key is because the earlier we detect this, the sooner we can start our interventions. Public health interventions, stockpiling interventions, and all those things that we need to be able to use. Surveillance is exactly the way you imagine it. Instead of being two detectives at the end of a dark alley looking for the bad guys, it is public health watching your laboratory results, watching who presents to their physicians with what kinds of illnesses, and all kinds of things. And there's surveillance on a global scale, which is predominantly done by the World Health Organization, and they have about 112 national influenza centers around the globe watching to make sure that this H5N1, or to tell everybody when this H5N1 becomes transmissible person to person. Now there's also surveillance here in Nebraska, meaning that we're watching things like laboratory results, watching people presenting to their physicians, because we wanted to be able to pick it up very early in the state of Nebraska so that we can intervene with all of this public health planning that we've been doing for a long time now.
Okay, and the hospitals are watching, the schools are watching, there's businesses, some major businesses in town are watching for absenteeism, right? And are asked to report those numbers, right, to the public health department.
Schools are reporting fairly regularly. Businesses, it depends on what business, and there's more that aren't than are.
Okay.
to be honest.
Okay, but that is another key, and that's something that you really are asking people to volunteer that information, because that will help you track whether or not we're seeing something like this in our area. Okay. Okay, so now we mentioned a little bit about businesses. How can they prepare for this? Should they be preparing?
Well, this has been probably one of the biggest movements that I've seen in the last 5 years in terms of trying to get buy-in from the community for a preparedness issue. I think that the pandemic issue itself is something that people are not able to say, well, we live in Nebraska, it's not going to happen here, because I think when they truly begin to understand what a pandemic is, they realize that this isn't going to be a Katrina, this isn't going to be in one location where you can call in the reinforcements, it's going to be happening everywhere. And so what we're telling our businesses is that what you need to expect is 40% absenteeism. So 40% of your people will not be there. They're either going to be ill themselves or they're going to be home caring for ill family members. So how do you continue operating with 40% fewer people? What kinds of things do we need to be thinking about? If you only have one person trained for one job, you really need to be thinking about cross-training. And for that, for small businesses, that's a big issue, because you often only have one person that does one job. So that's a new concept for a lot of businesses. Then we get into that issue of how are you going to continue operating your business by keeping people 6 feet apart? And that presents a huge challenge, but not one that isn't unsurmountable. So we talk about things like, could you operate shifts in your business? You may not do that normally, but could you actually have a third fewer people at work for 3 shifts a day? And they say, well, yeah, we could do that. Could you do every other cubicle? And many of them say, yeah, we could do that. Could you, with the right hardware, software, and connectivity, how many of your people could actually work from home? And we always get a lot of nods. You know, it's not part of our work ethic today, but we have to force businesses to think outside the box. The good news is that a lot of our infrastructure businesses, and what I mean by that are power, water, gas, those sort of amenities that we're going to need, are way ahead of the curve on pandemic planning, which is a very good thing. They really have very good plans in place, and they know what they're going to do to continue their operations by keeping people apart.
Okay. Well, I do know of a couple of businesses here in our Omaha community that are having meetings, pandemic flu meetings, saying, okay, here's the likely scenario, and this is what we're going to do. We want X and X to have laptops at home, that type of thing. That is critical, and you continue to encourage businesses to do so.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things that we did at the center when the pandemic flu monies were offered up this past year is that I found that as I was traveling around giving this presentation, the businesses were really beginning to ask for assistance. And so I ended up hiring someone who is solely dedicated to assisting businesses with their pandemic flu education and planning and exercising for that.
Okay. Then the next piece of it is, how can I prepare personally? We say that we should be prepared first, and then we should know that we can be prepared for our family and then our community. So how can I prepare?
And that's the key, and that's probably one of the biggest assets to having attended one of these presentations, at least from what I'm getting in terms of the feedback from the community, is that they're telling me that, you know, you hear what's happening, you hear what's coming, you know what's possible, you know how catastrophic can be, but you can't get your hands around how you can do anything about it. Well, this is where we actually give people the tools to do something. One of the most important things that a family can do to prepare for a pandemic is to stockpile food. Secretary Leavitt, our Secretary of Health and Human Services of the federal government, spent the first 6 months of last year traveling around this country telling communities, you need to be prepared at a household level, at a neighborhood level, and a community level. So begin stockpiling your food. What we recommend, what he recommended, was at least 4 weeks worth of supplies in your home. Now the average home has about 2 to 3 weeks if you get down to the crackers and the peanut butter if you had to, but most of us don't have that much. So what we have is a tool that helps people stockpile, and this particular tool was actually devised by Chevron in the 1990s based on a all hazards approach, tweaked a little bit by Columbus Hospital here in Nebraska, and then offered up to everybody. And we called it a 16-week stockpiling tool. And basically what it means is that every single week, like week 1, you go to the grocery store and you buy these 2 extra things. Week 2, you buy these 2 extra things. And by the end of 16 weeks, and I've seen 20-week versions, you have enough food in your household for 4 weeks. And that is something that people just really appreciated, saying, now I have something concrete that I can do.
Okay, and there are a couple of pamphlets floating around our community locally that you can get, and you can get some of these online. But the Douglas County Health Department, the Salvation Army, the Red Cross. This is actually a 20-week plan on how to stockpile, what to prepare. It breaks it down each week. Where do you go? The hardware store, the grocery store, what do you get, and what should you be doing? And then also the Nebraska Medical Center, University of Nebraska Medical Center, they also have another pamphlet, and I can tell you a couple of websites where you can get those. www.bioprepare.org. They actually have their list on there, as well as www.pandemicflu.gov and then /plan. So you can find that here. And people might think, oh my goodness, are you really serious about this? And where am I going to put this stuff? But you said that you've been doing it.
I have. I'm actually at about week 15 now. And it does work. It really does work. Space is sometimes an issue, but we found space in our home. It makes it much more financially palatable to be able to do when you're only buying a few extra things every week. It's not nearly as onerous as saying going out and buying 4 weeks worth of food all at once. And you can rotate it. You can keep an eye on things, making sure that things don't expire. And I just know I feel better knowing that I have it, and a lot of people do.
And I know a lot of people say, well, this really too isn't. It's not. These pamphlets are not just for avian flu.
Right.
These are for any disaster that you can be prepared in your home, that you could be able to survive without leaving the home for a while. Okay. I wanted you to also mention, now if we have a scenario, I'm ill with the flu, believe it's the virus, the pandemic flu. I'm supposed to stay in my home. What are the folks that live in my home? What are my family members supposed to do?
Well, your question's very timely. One of the things that we're devising right now is an educational package for people to educate them on how to care for the ill at home in a pandemic situation. And a lot of it is very common sense. It's based on just normal principles of infection control. So we're going to be guiding people through where should you put this person in your home that is ill, what room you should choose. If you have a bathroom to dedicate to them, that's great. If you don't, here's some techniques on scheduling other people in the bathroom, cleaning in between people to keep the environment clean. We talk about who should care for that ill person, how many people should be caregivers, because it shouldn't be everybody in the family. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You really only want one person. How do you protect that person who's caring for the one that's ill? We talk about nutrition. We talk about supplies that you should have on hand. We talk about even combining families. If I have a sister who lives down the block who has children, who has an ill person, maybe we can bring everybody or the ill into one household and decrease the amount of people that are exposed to that person. So that's coming. Stay tuned. And that's going to be the Health and Human Services folks at the State Health Department are going to be helping us package that and getting it out very similar to the way the stockpiling tool is being given out.
Okay. This pandemic flu could really be life-threatening to people of all ages. It's not just what we hear a lot of times, the elderly and the infants, to really taking special care.
Yes.
Well, that's probably a good consideration, again, with those age groups, but this is everyone. Everybody should be watching.
Absolutely, absolutely. What a lot of people don't understand is that unlike seasonal flu, which tends to affect the very young and the very old, pandemics have affected people in the prime of their lives. In 1918, it was people in their 20s and 30s that were dying. And H5N1, the bird flu, is affecting predominantly children and young adults.
Okay. Thank you so much for all of this information, and I know that it was very helpful to everyone. Again, you can pick up your 16-week household stockpiling pamphlets on the websites that we mentioned, www.bioprepare.org. Sharon Metcalf from the Center of Biopreparedness Education, thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for watching this edition of Consider This.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at unotv.unomaha.edu. If you'd like to share your comments about this show, call UNO TV at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours.
The 10th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by Blooms in Omaha, featuring floral arrangements and gifts. And by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Saturday at 6 p.m.